Candle Street lay, as if on purpose, slightly behind its more flamboyant neighbors, a Georgian cul-de-sac diverted from the traffic of clever people and given over to windows with drawn blinds and a few discreet brass plates. On certain nights, one narrow doorway declared itself by scent rather than light, the perfume of beeswax drawn up and into the cool evening like a prayer. That night, the door bore a paper card and copper plate, private view, and the little gallery within, contrived out of 2 rooms and an ante-room, had been arranged to look, with practiced negligence, like the drawing-room of a rather fastidious ghost. Inspector Roderick Alleyn, who had come not as a policeman but as the husband of a painter, did not immediately enter. He paused, Troy's hand light in the crook of his arm, and listened. The noise within was the noise of people attempting to be very quiet and very appreciative, which, when achieved, produces a mild hiss of whispers, the controlled bubble of laughter, and the incidental clink of glass upon glass. Beeswax does not quite smother the smell of money. He caught that too, and behind it, a rift of something acrid, varnish or anxiety. "Are you sure?" Troy said. "You won't be bored." "On the contrary," said Alleyn easily. "The police are passionate admirers of the arts. We seek them like truffles." She gave him the faint, irrepressible smile that had not changed since their first quarrel about a palette knife, and drew him in. The Candle Street gallery had been lent, endowed, or captured, one could not be certain, by Lady Honoria Vale. She stood near the mantelpiece, which had been asked to pretend itself simple and succeeded beautifully, and received guests with the affable gravity of a woman who believed society to be like porcelain, made to be handled, admired, and broken only by vulgar people. A string of pearls lay against the deep plum of her gown, as if, like her, they had been born to be precisely there. "Mrs. Alleyn, how good," she said, with that extravagant economy that comes from long practice. She turned, finding Alleyn, and widened her manner by a fraction to include him. "And Inspector, such a luxury to have you not about your dreadful business." "I am very thoroughly not about it," Alleyn said. He had always liked Lady Honoria, precisely because she was at once so genuine and so artificial that there seemed to be no contradiction to resolve. The artist watched from his corner like a cat trying not to startle himself. Julian Hart had a triangular face and painter's hands, the nails trimmed ruthlessly, the fingers stained at the cuticles with faint shadows of ultramarine and Mars black. He had arranged candles about the room with a showman's sense of theater. Their flames, in small silver holders and etched glass cups, trembled a little in the draughts set up by moving skirts and the passage of careful servants. They were not mere candles. They were part of Hart's work. His paintings, hung at a height that would displease a picture dealer and please a dramatist, were nocturnes. Alleyways with a single lamp, faces lifted towards shadow, mirrored tables with thin gleams running like fish along the edges. There was a series called Theatrical, Studies in Rehearsal, in which figures with lifted hands were caught mid-speech and seemed to hold their breath in the very paint. "Julian does things with light," Troy murmured. "Not entirely kind things." "And the darkness?" Alleyn asked. "Who does the darkness?" "Whoever paid for it," said Troy, with a little dryness that made him look at her. She was examining a canvas called Candle Street, Nocturne. "I'd better say hello. He sent me an invitation with a sketch of his cats." "Go and be admirable," Alleyn said. "I shall keep to the walls." He kept to them very well. He has the gift, which is half art and half breeding, of being in a room without intruding upon it. People discover him, if they are meant to, at exactly the moment they wish to. He discovered, in his turn, the gallery's minor staff, an elderly man in a black coat, the sort of coat that is never a dinner jacket, however much it tries, moving with a slow discretion from guest to guest bearing a polished tray. A younger person with clerical spectacles, crisp notes, and a pencil behind her ear stationed by a ledger and an arrangement of invitations, and at the far door, a maid with that curious look acquired by the very well-trained, alert yet invisible. The butler, if he was a butler in this curious demotic of art rooms and private dinners, had a curious head, narrow and slightly too long, with hair that had whitened at the temples in a manner that seemed obliging. He came silently to Alleyn and presented to him and to Lady Honoria a selection of what the evening called champagne, and what a stricter palate might call something else. "Thank you, Mr. Lady Honoria began. "Pym, my lady," he murmured. His voice was a shade more educated than his coat, and a shade less than his manner. "If Madam requires anything in particular, Mrs. Thorne will oblige." His eyes indicated the young woman with the pencil, who looked up the very instant she was thus referred to, and smiled with a competence that stopped short of cheerfulness. "Mrs. Thorne is Julian's manager," Troy explained later, "and his conscience, he does not always attend." But now he was attending with nervous exactness to an actress. The actress was one of those women to whom hats are a language. The hat she wore, a narrow brim set obliquely over an eye that had been drawn like a letter of credit, seemed to say, with warmth, "I am not pretending, I am only seen." Verity Gale had done the Frostham season last winter, and found herself, like a bird, folded into London. Hart, in an over-courteous manner, listened to her laugh that was all in the throat. He glanced once past, her to Troy, and his eyes changed, as eyes do when they meet someone whose gaze they respect and fear in almost equal measure. In another cluster, a man whose shoulders were square with old habits was explaining something to a girl in white. The man's face was a careful arrangement of disapproval and reluctance to be bored, a retired soldier's face that found itself in peacetime obliged to attend to art. Brigadier Sir Lionel Qualm's mustache made small judgments of its own. The girl in white, Cecily Arden, listened with the intensity of 19 and the candor of only childhood. She had good bones and a tendency to say nearly everything she thought. She had already all but said that a certain picture, which had as its central object a blackened candle with a faint smoke thread, made her cold. "It is not meant to be cozy," said Dr. Sebastian Gray, who had slid in without everyone's noticing. He was a scholar with a chair somewhere sound and minor, King's or the Courtauld, and his tie had been knotted by a mind elsewhere. "It refers, rather ruthlessly, to Ribera and to the Vanitas tradition. One candle for our little lives, Miss Arden." "Do we all blow out?" she asked. "At the same time?" "Decidedly not," murmured Dr. Gray. "Some are snuffed." He lifted his glass to his lips and looked over it at Sir Lionel with an almost culpable politeness. "But perhaps we needn't." Sir Lionel grunted, and over his shoulder Alleyn saw the actor-manager, Sir Felix Melbury, making his way across the room with that movement of the shoulders that makes space. Sir Felix had been handsome for too long to cease doing it. He had become, in the meantime, a personality, which is easier to keep than a profile. He greeted Lady Honoria with a flourish of good breeding and had his hand kissed in return by her niece's eyes. His glance rested for a moment on Verity Gale, the glance of a man who looks and also calculates the witness. It moved on and touched lightly Troy. "My very dear Mrs. Alleyn," he cooed, "what lawless extravagance in you to hide behind such lovely strength." He meant the picture beside Troy, and also meant Alleyn, and also how Troy stood. He was always meaning three things, and at least one of them was himself. "Mr. Hart," Troy said presently, and it was pleasant to hear in her voice that personal flatness that says, "We have met before, and whatever you imagine about that is your own affair. Your Candle Street is, well, it does rather what it intends. May I ask about the perspective, this line here?" She and Hart fell into that concentrated talk unmusical to anyone not in their trade. He replied with little precise movements of his hands, as if polishing truth. Mrs. Thorne, at her ledger, noted who stood where and for how long with the quickness of a woman to whom positions, in rooms and in lives, are facts. Basil Crome, the critic from the Observer, extracted a notebook and pretended to think better of it and put it away again, having been observed in the act by Lady Honoria's pearls, which managed somehow to express gentle disapproval. "It is all slightly archaic, isn't it?" Lady Honoria said to Alleyn, as if asking his permission. "Candles in the age of electricity." "I imagine," Alleyn said, "that Mr. Hart has found a way to make the light accountable. Switches are too casual." "Accountable," she repeated, considering it. What a serious word. Across the room, Verity Gale had acquired the attention of a small circle and was doing a story in her low register about a rehearsal in Salisbury, all snow and lost costumes, and the vicar's wife selling tea with a bustle that could have been used as a set. Sir Felix set in little chimes of correction. Dr. Gray supplied a link to restoration practices. Mrs. Thorne let her pencil rest, the better to listen. And just by them, Pym's head inclined by a degree towards the door. Something in the hall had moved. He did not look towards Mrs. Thorne, but she put down her pencil and went, with no fuss at all, to the anteroom. Alleyn, who sees the first ripple when others are not aware that there is a pool, did not turn. He observed instead the small picture by the mantelpiece, an interior with a chair that stands slightly out of proportion to the fireplace. There was a candlestick on the mantel, not unlike those arranged around the room, but this had a curious embellishment, a little nick on the rim, as if metal had been lifted by heat and then pressed down again by a finger. It was on the painted one. On the real mantel, before him, a similar candlestick stood with an identical nick. "It's repetition," Troy said, following his gaze as if he had announced it aloud. "He repeats objects across pictures. There's a bell somewhere." "Ah." Alleyn's eyes moved and were rewarded by the sight of a handbell, squat and domestic, with a braided cord. "Ritual," he said. "Ritual," she assented. "He must have it. He rings that at the end of the private view and the maid passes the little Florentines. That sort of thing." "That sort of thing," said Alleyn, and thought, as he sometimes did, how very much we tell one another by the degree to which we can smile at our own arrangements. He noticed, too, a paper tucked just beneath the bell's foot. An invitation card, perhaps, used to steady it on the polished wood because the table leaned very slightly to the left. Cecily Arden, who was not behaving badly enough to attract formal rebuke, but not quite properly either, had drifted to a corner where Mrs. Thorne's ledger lay open. She looked down and then up in great innocence, and met Mrs. Thorne returning. To say that something passed between them would be too robust. Rather, the space acknowledged itself. Mrs. Thorne's hand became indifferent and closed the ledger. Cecily colored and said a few things very quickly about a painting of a woman's back in a mirror. "Those are theatrical backs," Verity Gale said lightly, arriving. "Women who have been told how to curve for the gods." She smiled at the girl in a way that meant her no harm and told her so by making it almost too obvious. "You will learn, darling, but perhaps from a different teacher." Sir Lionel watched that little exchange with a distinct discomfort that manifested as a clearing of the throat. "Ahem," he said to nobody in particular, and improved his stance. Dr. Gray collected it with a neat "yes" and a glance toward Sir Felix. Basil Crome wrote something down after all. There may be, Alleyn thought, no more precise language on earth than the one in which we disapprove of each other. "Inspector," said Lady Honoria, "you are not drinking. Pym, do see." "Certainly, my lady," said Pym. He filled Alleyn's glass, as if pouring not wine but caution. No spill, barely a click, a nod that did not intrude upon the native privacy of the action. "We shall ring in 10 minutes, my lady." Mrs. Thorne had returned, her eyes far away for a second in the lower corridor, and then quite present again. 10, she said. "Very good, Pym." Verity Gale was laughing again, this time at something Sir Felix said about directors, and it had the sound of a woman proving that she could still be pleased. Julian Hart, listening to Troy, had fallen into one of those odd silences talented men adopt when they wish to be thought humble. He almost meant it, and therefore could not help himself. Lady Honoria glanced, with a proud, small anxiety, at a gentleman mounting the 2 shallow steps at the end of the room and recognized him as the banker she had hoped for and hoped against. Dr. Gray found something rather ugly and applauded it. Cecily looked up and slipped an arm through her aunt's and was quietly replaced by Lady Honoria's fingertips at a correct distance. Alleyn let all this come past him. He observed the action of Pym's hands, which were careful, the smudges on the paint where Hart had not entirely removed some charcoal when he transferred a drawing, the slight lateral give in the bell when Mrs. Thorne steadied it. He noted that a candle guttered briefly by the lower door and was pinched, and by whom, very quietly. The maid. He saw that the painted candlestick's nick was on the left, while the real one's was on the right, and did not at all know what to do with that morsel, and therefore stored it. "Shall we have them, Pym?" Lady Honoria said, that blend of command and charm. "If you please, my lady," Pym answered. He lifted the bell in a way that suggested he did not ring it often, but always intended to do so exquisitely. He moved to the center of the room, held the bell, and waited until the whispers had noticed him. Verity's voice dropped. Sir Felix's hand made a concluding pirouette in the air. The little gallery collected itself, like a courtesy, around the idea of silence. Pym rang the bell. It made a domestic, not a theatrical sound, the sort of sound large houses like to hear. The candles, obedient to nothing, continued their small, definite burning. "Mrs. Thorne," Lady Honoria said, "the Florentines. And if people would move, perhaps, yes, towards Candle Street. Mr. Hart will say something." Julian Hart, thus summoned, cleared his throat and didn't. "It is very moderate," Troy murmured to Alleyn, "to make him speak." "It is also," Alleyn said, "part of the amusement." Hart found a few sentences that paid homage to Lady Honoria, to Troy, to the late light of the year, and to the people in the paintings who have done me the honor of being themselves. There was a murmur that meant people wanted things to go on, and also to be over. Mrs. Thorne distributed a tray of thin, sugary things, whose scent wrinkled the air. Pym, unobtrusive, went again to the far door. In the anteroom, beyond that door, there was a minor adjustment. It was not a noise. It was the absence of a noise that should have been heard. The little click of the latch closing. Alleyn did not say anything at all. He stood, and his eyes moved, and from the corner of his sight he saw Mrs. Thorne's hand pause for the fraction of a second on the neck of a decanter as if she had been touched. He saw the maid, dark, tidy, serious, set down the empty tray and remove herself. He saw Pym just then, remembering something he had not forgotten, and turn, with that controlled unhurriedness he had learnt as a lower footman when men wore their class in their knees. He saw Lady Honoria, after her bell, relax her shoulders by 8 degrees. The bell was set down, the little card was again employed. Julian Hart laughed suddenly and turned towards Troy with a private, hopeful look, as if to say, "Do you suppose I've got away with it?" Sir Felix began a story about a matinee audience that had eaten oranges. Basil Crome thought of a title. Cecily Arden, properly, lifted a Florentine and then did not eat it. Dr. Sebastian Gray said, "Vanitas." Sir Lionel Qualm's moustache expressed it had seen worse in India. And on the mantelpiece, the candle with the nick burned with the steadiness of something that believes itself immortal. The room, held together by its decorum, by the little ceremonies people use like ribbons, maintained itself. Underneath, where the narrow corridor ran to a door that led to a smaller private room and beyond that to a stair, something fractional shifted and lay the weight of its change upon the air, not enough to break it, and quite enough to be felt by a man who had trained, for much of his life, to notice. Alleyn's hand, the one that did not hold the ridiculous champagne, very lightly adjusted his cuff. He thought, without fright, but with a correctness of nerve that had nothing to do with the glass in his fingers, that Candle Street would, before the candles were one by one extinguished, ask something of him beyond attendance. He set down the glass he had not drunk, and smiled at Lady Honoria as if nothing he had ever done had been other than social. He admired, which was true, the profile of the housemaid as she passed. He looked at Troy's shoulder, and then at the bell. "Well," he said, "shall we go and look at the back room? People always do when they think they oughtn't." "Of course," said Troy, amused, "with that air you have of being not at all to blame." They went. Behind them, Pym, who had in his marrow that sort of knowledge that cannot be taught, angled his steps by an inch and said to Mrs. Thorne, very distinctly and very quietly, "If you please." And Mrs. Thorne, who would not tell tales while there was breath in her body, nodded and looked down and adjusted again the bell. It rang, very slightly, of its own accord, or perhaps that is fanciful. In any case, the room heard nothing but itself. Candle Street had scrubbed its stones for the evening so that the lamplight ran like watered silk along the pavement and stopped, very politely, at the steps of Peveril's gallery. Inside, the air was polished with beeswax and the faintest thread of turpentine, and the rooms contrived to look casually arranged while admitting a calculation in every angle. The centerpiece, Julian Vale's large canvas titled "The Shadow over Candle Street," hung with a theatrical indifference as if it had been placed there by accident and could not be persuaded to move. Lady Honoria St. Clair arrived in a shimmer of sable and good humor which was never to be trusted. She gave her hand to Mr. Peveril, who bowed as though he had rehearsed the moment before a pier glass. "Darling man, the light is too good. It makes us all honest," she murmured, and Peveril's smile acquired a second layer, lacquer over enamel. Vale had placed himself at a tactical remove from his own picture. He was a slight man with a well-kept untidiness, as if his hair had taken a spirited decision after careful thought. He spoke to the actress Viola Kent, whose famous voice made even compliments sound like lines from a part she had chosen wisely. "It is only a street," Vale said, looking not at her but into the painting where a tram line and a shadow nearly met. "But one depends upon the other." "Darling," said Viola, "so do we all." A retired general, Bracknell, clinked his monocle at the frame and pronounced it curiously exact, which was his manner of conceding defeat. Near him, the critic Oliver Calthorpe produced a little hum of attention and began to describe the moral condition of shadow, an exercise he performed with inertia and profit. "One can always trust a shadow to belong to something else," he said to nobody in particular, and several people arranged their faces into interest without obliging him with assent. Troy, whose own small canvas, hung modestly in a side room, had come because Peveril was a friend, and because Vale's work had, rather to her surprise, moved her. Beside her stood her husband, Inspector Roderick Alleyn, not in his official capacity, and dressed as if he had always belonged in rooms like this without ever needing to. He let the talk sift past him like warm gold and watched with that mild attention which made some people feel warmed and others exposed. "Is it pleasing to you?" Troy asked, her head tilted, as if the painting and she had entered into a compact. "It has a quiet in it," Alleyn said, "and something withheld." He had a tall man's trick of seeming to lean without moving, and at this, Viola Kent, who recognized a composed face when she saw one, gave him an appraising glance. Troy, with the gentlest flicker of amusement, said, "Viola Kent is hunting on the margins," and Alleyn's mouth twitched. Peveril's secretary, Miss Leda Crane, moved like a drawn thread through the rooms, correcting a card here, replacing a glass there, and once, very swiftly, removing a tiny curl of paper that had flaked from a label and landed on the baseboard under Vale's picture. She dropped it into her pocket with the same unobtrusive care a good housekeeper devotes to a stain noticed before the guests do. The footman, Peveril kept a footman, which was part of his business, offered sherry from a round tray that never tilted. When he poured, the liquid folded into itself with the discretion of an old secret. There were, as there always are, tiny accidents. Viola Kent's bracelet caught in the lace of Lady Honoria's cuff, and the two women disentangled themselves with a laughter that had points in it. Calthorpe, attempting a remark to Troy about tonal values, dropped his program and stooped for it with a grunt that suggested moral fatigue. General Bracknell, peering again at the canvas, said to Vale, "You've got the corners dead right," to which Vale replied, "The corners do the work," and looked tired. Near the door stood a tall glass case in which Peveril kept small desperations, a snuff-box, a miniature, a paper knife with a mother-of-pearl handle. The case had a lock. Peveril had the key on a ribbon in his waistcoat pocket and touched it now and then, the way some men adjust a tie. Insurance, he had called it in Troy's hearing once, not entirely of the objects. From time to time the gallery's bell sounded discreetly, and another guest arrived with rain on the shoulders and a name that mattered more or less. The street outside breathed damp and reflected the passers-by without ever quite revealing them. Inside, talk thinned and grew again, and one felt the moment, always present at such gatherings, when people began to say less in order to mean more. Lady Honoria, leaning towards Peveril, let fall a remark in undertone that made his hand tighten on the key ribbon. Vale looked over and then away, his face carefully blank. "Julian," said Viola softly, "you could have left the title as untitled and spared yourself sermons." "It wanted a name," he answered, "and one must give something." He turned then, almost despite himself, and his glance struck Troy and bounced to Alleyn, who returned it with polite absence, as if he had been thinking of the weather that Candle Street made for itself. At 9:30 the sherry was replenished with the same old discretion. Miss Crane, with that small, secretive economy of movement, adjusted the catalogue stack so that the topmost copy faced the room and showed the title in a firm, unfussy type. In the hall, a clock announced the half-hour with its restrained throat. The evening, it seemed, had taken its shape. Nothing had happened. Everything had begun. The hour that galleries pretend not to acknowledge, the moment of the patron's toast, drew near. A discreet bell sounded from the far room where the champagne had been arranged with the chill respect afforded to a sacrament. Lady Beatrice lifted her gaze from a ledger of promised purchases, and, with the faintest inclination of her head, sent Miss Leda Crane to retrieve Sir Geoffrey Temple, who had melted away, as elderly men do, into the quieter edges of company. Miss Crane, the very embodiment of efficient silence, threaded past the groupings of talk and light, past Whitmore's attentive pivot and Mrs. Pemberton's bright fragility. The small anteroom beyond the print cases, reserved for donors who wished to sit, had a single shaded lamp, a narrow table, and one Georgian chair whose horsehair seat had been softened by time and benevolent neglect. It was here she found him. Sir Geoffrey sat as though listening to a confidence. His head had tipped to one side with an air of politeness, his mouth slightly open, his hands resting upon the head of his ebony walking stick. The catalogue lay on the table with a folded pair of gloves atop it, and over the chair's carved arm someone had laid a square of fine muslin such as is used to veil work not yet ready for light. For a moment, Miss Crane saw only decorum, a gentleman in contemplation, a cloth in its proper place, a lamp perfectly judged. Then the stillness deepened into a silence that was not repose. "Sir Geoffrey," she said softly, and receiving no reply, stepped closer with the measured calm of one who understands that panic is a vulgarity. She touched his sleeve, lightly, respectfully, and drew back as if the room had cooled. Miss Crane neither cried out nor swayed. She walked back into the corridor with a measured step and met Whitmore's glance precisely as he turned with a tray of glasses. He set it down without a sound. "If you would come," she murmured. Alleyn had watched Miss Crane's progress with the idle attention of a guest who notices the movements of staff as one notes the hands of a clock. He saw Whitmore's face change by the smallest degree and followed at a distance, which avoided intrusion and yet did not exclude him from usefulness. Troy, perceiving the same change, shifted unobtrusively to Lady Beatrice's side. In the anteroom, Whitmore halted and, without apparent motion, excluded the rest of the world. Alleyn stepped in and bent, his hand, long, light, resting against Sir Geoffrey's wrist. He waited, looking not at the face but at the small hollow beneath the ear. When he withdrew his hand, he paused again, as though listening to something beyond sound. "Miss Crane," he said very quietly, "would you be so kind as to ask that a doctor be telephoned at once, and to inform Lady Beatrice discreetly that Sir Geoffrey is unwell?" Miss Crane vanished like a thought obeyed. Whitmore stood with his head slightly lowered. His courtesy seemed to have entered a deeper register. "Inspector," he began, then checked himself, remembering the social fiction of Alleyn's presence. "Mr. Alleyn." "Just Alleyn will do," said the inspector mildly. He glanced at the small table. There was a thin ring of damp upon the mahogany, and beside it a champagne flute whose lip showed a faint crescent of moisture. Sir Geoffrey's gloves were folded with military neatness. A pencil lay across the catalogue, marking a page in the essay on the veiled truth. The pencil's point had scored a short line in the margin as if it had slipped and stopped. A faint odour, delicate and ambivalent, lay beneath the room's beeswax and clean linen, something not unlike bitter peel, scarcely more than a suggestion. Alleyn did not follow it with his nose. He merely registered it as one might register a draught in a church. Lady Beatrice came without hurry, her calm, this evening's hostly instrument, untouched. Troy's presence was a quiet flank. Mrs. Pemberton hovered at the threshold, her fingers whitening on the pearls that were both armour and habit. Hartwell, drawn by the sudden absence of attention in the main gallery, appeared and halted as if called to order by a voice from his school days. The artist's face, already strained by admiration, took on a new pallor. A small smudge of grey paint shone incongruously at the edge of his cuff. "A doctor is on his way," Miss Crane reported, and Lady Beatrice inclined her head. "We shall keep our guests to the main room," she said. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps you would be so good as to adjust the screens." There was no rush, no cry, no fracture of the evening's lacquer beyond the fine crack that travels beneath the surface and is only seen when light strikes it from a certain angle. Whitmore drew the door almost shut. From beyond it came the orchestrated sound of social courage. A new topic raised, a laugh achieved without effort, the tinkle of glass against glass like distant bells in fog. Alleyn stood very still, his gaze moving not only across objects, but through their arrangement. The muslin fold on the chair arm is too careful to be accidental. The catalogue's page dog-eared in a manner too precise to be the work of a casual hand. Sir Geoffrey's stick stood planted, aligned with the table's corner, an old soldier in the posture of waiting. He did not yet ask a question. He simply allowed the room to tell him, in its own language, that something gently, implacably, had altered. Inspector Alleyn arrived at Montague Square with that unhurried punctuality which spares the living and pays its courtesy to the dead. The house possessed the self-respect of good brick and old money. Its threshold offered him neither welcome nor warning. Mrs. Dalrymple conducted him up the wide stair, her hands clasped low as if to steady propriety itself. Lady Beatrice stood in the corridor, her face composed, Miss Crane a half-step behind, with a folded list and an air of quiet competence. Dr. Pemberton, a neat, compact man with careful eyes, emerged from the study and lifted his hat. an old-fashioned gesture that seemed to seal the room. "Inspector," Lady Beatrice said, "nothing about this is melodramatic." Sir Geoffrey was not a man for theatrics. "No," Alleyn answered. "Nor are you, Lady Beatrice. May I?" They let him pass. The study received him with the faint aroma of beeswax and old leather and something else. Brandy, certainly, and a crisp tang of damp wool. The October light was thin, drawn through gauze curtains that made the square beyond appear a wash of pale green and slate. Sir Geoffrey sat as described, formal in his evening clothes, as if paused between toasts. The brandy on the side table held a sheen that caught the window's diluted brightness. Beside it lay the gallery catalogue open to Hartwell's The Veiled Truth, a magnifying glass positioned over a darkness at the extreme right of the reproduction, where the painted curtains fold might or might not suggest the presence of a figure. Alleyn stood a little apart and let the room speak. The grate had been laid but not lit. A single spent match lay on the hearthrug, half burned, as if rejected for insufficiency. On the escritoire, a blotter, a heavy nib pen, a small pile of correspondence faced at right angles to the edge. One envelope bore Lady Beatrice's hand. Its seal remained unbroken. Miss Crane, he recalled, had been sent with a parcel. This, then, was its duplicate, or its counterpart. He glanced back. On the console by the door lay a brown paper packet, neatly tied, with the gallery's crest in gold, unopened. 2 catalogues, then. Sir Geoffrey's own from the night before had supplied the text upon the table. He saw, too, the small economies of habit. A silver box for studs, lid ajar, a pair of half-moon spectacles folded with military exactitude beside a Times crossword whose last clue ended abruptly in a perfectly formed T. And there were the betrayals of chance. On the polished wood of the side table, near the brandy, a second, fainter ring suggested a glass that had been removed. The dust upon the desk had been disturbed subtly in a crescent that did not accord with Sir Geoffrey's reach. A fine ash rested in the saucer of a Chinese bowl. Cigarette ash, feathery and pale. There was a pipe rack on the mantel, filled and orderly. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat, apologetic without words. "You found no sign of struggle," Alleyn said, not as a question. "None. Heart failure would seem adequate. He was an old man, Inspector, though he resented the designation." Alleyn bent, without touching, to consider Sir Geoffrey's hands. Clean, the nails trimmed, a minute smear on the left cuff of something that might have been charcoal or the ghost of a pencil. His gaze returned to the magnifying glass, to the painted shadow it framed. He thought of Sir Geoffrey at the gallery, his courteous persistence and the artist's recoil. He turned to the window. The latch was fastened. A thin line of grime at the catch suggested it had not been opened in recent days. The rain had kept to its business through the night. The sill showed no splash or stain. In the corner, by the bookcase, stood an umbrella, its silk tight and damp in tidy pleats. A hat, glossy and respectable, took its ease on a chair. There was no wet footprint on the turkey carpet. If a visitor had come, he, or she, had moved with care, or not come by the front. Alleyn let silence extend itself. He disliked to break rooms that had so carefully composed themselves around the newly absent. At length he looked toward Lady Beatrice, who had remained precisely within her dignity. "Thank you for calling me." "Later thought," Lady Beatrice began, then stopped. "We did not wish to be foolish?" "Foolishness would have been to assume," Alleyn said. "Miss Crane, you discovered him." "Yes, Inspector." She met his look directly. "I did not touch anything. I'm grateful." He allowed himself a small smile. "One question only, for now. Did Sir Geoffrey customarily take brandy alone in the evenings?" Mrs. Dalrymple, attentive in her corner, answered with respectful firmness. "A small glass after supper, sir. Never 2. and he would always change before sitting here. Alleyn nodded. He took in the evening clothes, the unopened packet, the double presence of the catalogue. He looked once more at Hartwell's painting in miniature and at the magnifier's unwavering circle. "Very good," he said gently. "We shall disturb as little as we can. Then perhaps we may ask a little of the living." The drawing room had been prepared for condolence rather than interrogation. A tea tray with thin slices of lemon, a discreet fire with its cheerful pretense carefully moderated, and curtains drawn to that exact degree which admits light without admitting glare. Lady Beatrice presided from a small sofa as from a raft in uncharted waters. Miss Crane hovered with documents no one would read. Dr. Pemberton, compact and rosy, settled himself as if taking the weather. Alleyn began with courtesy. "I am grateful for your patience, Lady Beatrice. These are trifling inquiries. You saw Sir Geoffrey last night?" "At the gallery, of course." Her hands, graceful and still, lay upon her lap like two attentive birds. He praised Mr. Hartwell's capacity for chiaroscuro and deplored, mildly, the young man's theatricality. He was in excellent spirits when he left. "At what hour?" "A little after 10, I think." She considered, and the pause was as deliberate as a fan's opening. "We had a small knot at the door, patrons delaying to settle commitments. Sir Geoffrey was never fond of farewells." "You did not see him again?" She smiled. Perfect tact's most ambiguous instrument. "We are neighbors in habit rather than geography." "No. Forgive me. Who smokes cigarettes in your circle?" His glance took in the faint ash he had noticed in the study's bowl. "James Whitmore, the curator. Some of the artists, almost never Sir Geoffrey." He loathed the smell. She looked toward Miss Crane. "Later." "Mr. Hartwell occasionally," Miss Crane supplied, "but he is very poor at it and coughs." Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat with the proprietary authority of diagnosis. Sir Geoffrey's lungs were sound enough. His heart was the offender. He had been under my care for mild angina. I prescribed nitroglycerin tablets to be taken as required. "You found no bottle?" "In the top right drawer," Alleyn said. "Unopened." The physician's ruddy coloring diminished a shade. He was obstinate, an old school of endurance. "Was there any agitation last night that might have induced him to neglect them?" Lady Beatrice's gaze moved to the fire. Art exerts its small storms. There was talk of a preliminary sketch to The Veiled Truth, a rumor Sir Geoffrey chose to discourage. The existence of such a thing complicates sales. She spoke as one naming a candlestick. "I told him gossip need not be answered." "Yet he made inquiries," Alleyn said. Sir Geoffrey had a soldier's fondness for reconnaissance. Miss Crane, very correct, offered a folded paper. "Sir Geoffrey telephoned the gallery around 11. He asked whether our catalogue plates included an image of the original study. I informed him they did not. I made a note for the files." "You were still at the gallery at 11? "Closing procedures," she said. The phrase, discreet as a curtain, asked him not to peer beyond it. "Dr. Pemberton," Alleyn murmured. "Was there any incompatibility between a small brandy and his prescription?" "In theory, no. In practice, only if taken to excess, which your glass suggests it was not." Mrs. Dalrymple appeared with the quiet tread of a figure accustomed to thresholds. Her apron had the chastened crispness of recent starch. "Beg pardon, my lady. The undertaker's man is below." "Thank you, Mrs. Dalrymple," Lady Beatrice said, the timbre of command softened by bereavement. "We will be down shortly." Alleyn addressed the housekeeper with a mildness that had coaxed secrets from sterner souls. "You heard Sir Geoffrey return last night?" "I heard the front door at the 11:30, sir. He would bring in his own latchkey. I take no liberties with gentlemen's hours." "Any caller?" Her eyes flickered toward Lady Beatrice and away. "Not to my knowledge, sir." "Quite. Perhaps later we might have a word in the kitchen." "If you wish, sir." The little scene dispersed itself with the decorum of a drawing-room exit. Alleyn left a moment with the muted fire, reviewed the careful distances everyone had kept. Politeness had arranged the furniture. Something less accommodating had arranged the facts. He asked for his hat and, with the slightest apology, said he would look in at the gallery before luncheon. The servants' hall at Montague Square offered its own decorum, a polished table, blue willow cups, and the singing whistle of a kettle that would not be hurried. Mrs. Dalrymple sat very straight, her capable hands folded, and regarded Inspector Alleyn with that clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who has spent her life knowing when to speak and when to be still. "You're very good to indulge me, Mrs. Dalrymple," Alleyn said. "It's only that habits are so often the authors of explanations." "A house tells on itself, sir," she replied quietly. Sir Geoffrey kept it so. Her account was simple, reluctant to be anything more. She had emptied the ashtrays yesterday afternoon, a dusting every day and a thorough on Fridays. So the pale, feathery ash on the Chinese saucer must be new. Sir Geoffrey did not permit cigarettes indoors. He'd a pipe of an evening if the doctor allowed, but that was all. She had not seen a stranger enter after his return. But then he would not have wished me to see. The smallest hesitation accompanied this, like the pause of a needle over a fragile record. "And you caught no name on the midnight call?" Her lips compressed. "Only that his 'not at this hour, madam' was sharper than I've heard him in years. He was a gentleman to the last." Alleyn let silence do the work it often does. It brought forth another thread. "There is his tray, sir," she added. "He takes a glass in the study when he returns of an evening, leaves the cufflinks in the little silver dish, and sends up for his night water. The carafe hasn't been touched. The cufflinks are still in his sleeves. It was not his way." He thanked her and found Miss Crane waiting in the passage, propriety in person. Her gloved hands were immaculate, a faint, clean scent, not perfume but something astringent, lingered about her like a studio washed at daybreak. "If there is anything I may do for Lady Beatrice, Inspector," she said. "You already do a great deal, I think. May I ask, did you return to the gallery after closing last night?" A question. Her eyebrows made the slightest lift, as if acknowledging a well-played move. "Yes, a misprint was discovered in the catalogue list for Lot 12. Mr. Whitmore telephoned me. I went back to adjust the card stock before morning callers." "The hour?" 11:30, perhaps a little later. "The porter was there. He is always there when he is needed." It was perfectly spoken and perfectly unrevealing. "I left within 20 minutes. With anyone?" "Alone, Inspector." He did not contradict her. Instead, he asked if she had known Sir Geoffrey to be interested in working studies. Her gaze touched the floor and returned. He took an academic interest in process. He thought finished things were sometimes too finished. A precise, careful sentence that looked in two directions at once. It was after midday when Alleyn stepped beneath the Ashworth Gallery's awning on Candle Street. The rain had thinned to a fine embroidery. Inside, the public rooms were dimmed. The private side of art busied itself with accounts and framing wire. A man in a porter's jacket, Mr. Cribb according to a brass badge, emerged from the basement with a bundle of brown paper and the circumspect air of one who has watched a great deal and intends to keep his teeth. "Good day to you, sir." "Alleyn Police, I wonder if we may have a word, Mr. Cribb, in the matter of late callers." "Late callers?" His eyes slid to the side passage where the office lay. "We lock at 10. After that, it's only the few as has business." "And last night?" He thought about the clock on the wall rather than the question. "Miss Crane, sir. Very steady young lady. Knew just what she wanted. Downstairs, press cupboard, card blanks, paste. Didn't trouble no one." "No one else?" A pause uncoiled like a cat. "Someone as smokes them little foreigners, if you'll pardon. The sort in a holder. You know the flavour, sir. Dry and a bit churchy. We don't encourage it near the canvases. I didn't see him, mind. I'm down below when I'm down below. Quite. And the office telephone went after the bell. Mr. Whitmore took it in quiet. That's his privilege. Alleyn left him with thanks and returned to Montague Square as the afternoon faded, the light in Sir Geoffrey's study the colour of old vellum. He stood a little apart from the chair and let the room compose itself around him. The cuff-link dish was innocent of metal. The carafe wore its domed lid like a formal hat at a funeral. On the brandy table a faint second ring, paler than the first, lay like the echo of a conversation. The house spoke its language of routines and small obediences. Somewhere in it a gesture had been amended with courtesy and intent. Alleyn, who trusted the grammar of such things, felt the sentence forming and did not yet supply the verb. The house had settled into that careful quiet which attends bereavement once the first courtesies are exchanged and the day's inevitable movements resume their decorous pace. Alleyn asked, very gently, to be shown what was usual, and Mrs. Dalrymple, grateful for a task that was both practical and reverent, obliged with the precision of a woman whose life had been measured by another's habits. Sir Geoffrey was a man of rules, Inspector. We lived by them, and it kept the household easy. "Show me the rules," Alleyn said. She began upstairs. On the valet stand his nightshirt lay folded with military economy. Beside it the slippers, warming pan, never used. "I place it ready," he always smiles and says we're not in the Crimea. And an open Waterford carafe, whose waterline, dust-filmed, declared it untouched since yesterday morning. His bed, turned down at 10, had not been lain in. Alleyn regarded the immaculate counterpane, then the small carriage clock on the mantel. "He winds it at 11:30, Mrs. Dalrymple said. "Every night without fail." It showed 5 minutes fast, as Sir Geoffrey preferred, to keep himself in front of the world, and had kept running through the night. He had not come up to honour his clock. Back in the study, Alleyn stood where the dead man had sat. The brandy in the snifter was scarcely diminished. The catalogue spread to Hartwell's veiled portrait, the magnifying glass a deliberate lens upon a shadow. He took in, without apparent focus, the placement of objects that had acquired the weight of custom. The silver ashtray to the right of the armchair, always polished, always used when Sir Geoffrey smoked his pipe. The Chinese saucer, part of a pair for visiting cards, on the low table opposite. The pipe rack full, the tobacco jar undisturbed. "Mrs. Dalrymple, do you polish the ashtrays in the morning?" "After breakfast, sir. Yesterday they were done. Last night before I retired, the ashtray was at his right hand. Empty, of course. He never left it unclean." Alleyn lifted the Chinese saucer with 2 fingers by its rim. Within lay a drift of pale ash, feather-fine. It had not fallen in a pipe smoker's slow cones, but lay as if tipped or tapped with a quick, uncertain gesture. No stub remained. He held the saucer nearer, not to inhale so much as to allow a memory of scent to pass. There was the faint sweetness and dryness of a Turkish blend. He set it down very gently. "Sir Geoffrey did not smoke cigarettes?" "Never, Inspector. He said they were untidy, and no guest would put ash in that saucer. He told everyone it was for cards only." "Everyone?" Her certainty faltered. "Everyone who came often." Alleyn let the implication rest. He moved to the escritoire and opened the top left drawer where a small Morocco case lay with a neat stack of blue silk, bookmarks, narrow ribbons Sir Geoffrey used for his books. He withdrew one, then looked at the catalogue. A slim strip marked the page beneath the magnifying glass. He slid it out. Not ribbon, but paper, torn cleanly from a heavier sheet, faintly watermarked. He held it to the light. In the watermark, the winged torch and capital A of the Ashworth Gallery's letterhead. Sir Geoffrey kept his own markers to hand, Alleyn said, not quite a question. "Yes, Inspector, he liked things tidy." Then last night he chose a torn scrap rather than a ribbon 2 inches away. He replaced the strip. Or someone else did. On the telephone table, the message pad showed a top leaf removed. Alleyn ran the flat of a pencil across the second sheet. The strokes revealed nothing legible, only the ghost of hurried pressure. He inspected the bell push and the door. The latch turned cleanly, a smudge on the inner plate that did not match Mrs. Dalrymple's housekeeping, as if a damp glove had touched and gone. The window fastenings were in night position, just as she had set them. "There is also this, Inspector," Mrs. Dalrymple said, almost in apology, and produced from the hall a little tray for visiting cards. "I dusted it yesterday at 4. When I came down this morning, there was a clean rectangle. One card had lain there, gathered a rim of dust, and had been taken away in the night." "And the name?" "I never saw it. Sir Geoffrey kept that tray for people he meant to see again." Alleyn stood very still, as if listening for a faint echo. A man who lived by rituals had departed from several in a single night. The rhythm had been broken at the surface and elsewhere preserved with extreme care. A visitor who did not know where to put ash. A torn strip where a ribbon should have lain. A vanished card. He thanked Mrs. Dalrymple and stepped into the cool passage. "I think I shall take a turn by Candle Street," he said, as though he proposed a walk for the air. It might be instructive to observe how other people arrange their mornings. The afternoon drew in without theatrics, the London light withdrawing as if embarrassed by its own inadequacy. Alleyn, after a sober luncheon and a brief, silent exchange with Troy, was on the point of drafting a note to the coroner when the telephone intervened with a discreet insistence. Lady Beatrice's voice, modulated and cool, carried an undertone of strain. "Inspector, I'm afraid we have had a rather awkward communication at the gallery. It purports to be from Sir Geoffrey, dated this morning, requesting the immediate dispatch of a particular item. Perhaps you might, if convenient, call." "If convenient." Alleyn replaced the receiver with a faint, private smile and sent for his hat. Candle Street wore its wet pavements like an old silk fringed with damp. The Ashworth Gallery's door stood closed to the public and opened to him with the soft mechanical bow of a spring latch. James Whitmore met him in the front room, discreetly anxious, the curator's hands folded like an altar boy's. "In Lady Beatrice's office, Inspector." He led the way through a corridor where Hartwell's canvases glimmered like guarded confidences. Lady Beatrice received Alleyn behind a clear desk whose tidy surface promised sense and delivered policy. Miss Leda Crane stood a precise step behind her employer's chair, the neat ledger open, pen laid across its spine with the exactness of a surgical instrument at rest. Mrs. Dorothea Pemberton fluttered on a small sofa, the pearls at her throat performing a minor tremor. "Here," Lady Beatrice said, offering a single envelope on a blotter. "Delivered by the morning post." The hand appears to be Sir Geoffrey's. It asks for the immediate delivery of the preliminary study for Mr. Hartwell's Veiled Truth to be sent round to Montague Square. The difficulty, as you perceive, is twofold. Alleyn glanced at the letter. The hand was indeed very like. Firm, old-fashioned, with the particular loop to the G he had seen on Sir Geoffrey's book plates. Yet a slight irregularity in the spacing suggested either haste or imitation. The paper was of good quality, but not Sir Geoffrey's usual laid stock. The watermark, faint but present, belonged to a popular stationer near Piccadilly. The first difficulty, Alleyn said, almost to himself, being that Sir Geoffrey cannot have posted this letter this morning. And the second, Lady Beatrice replied, that the study is not at present to hand. Not to hand. Mrs. Pemberton gave a soft, bird-like sound. "Oh, Beatrice." Lady Beatrice's gaze checked her co-owner with a glance brief enough to be courteous. "Inspector, in strictest confidence, the preliminary study was placed with us on deposit last week. Mr. Hartwell, for reasons of prudence and insurance, consented to its being held in our safe pending valuation. Only Mr. Whitmore, Miss Crane, Mrs. Pemberton, and I were aware of it. This morning, upon receiving the letter, we went at once to confirm its status. The safe is undisturbed. The study is not there." Whitmore's careful composure thinned. "The safe shows no interference, Inspector. The other contents are intact. The study's portfolio, labeled in my hand, is absent. It was here late yesterday afternoon. I initialed the inventory at closing." "And the keys?" Alleyn asked, his tone mild. "Lady Beatrice. Myself. Miss Crane," Whitmore replied. "A duplicate held by the bank for emergencies. No other." Miss Crane's eyes met Alleyn's with exemplary steadiness. "I locked the safe at 6 yesterday. Lady Beatrice and I left by the front door together. Mr. Whitmore closed the premises after the reception concluded." "And this morning?" "I unlocked the safe at 10:30 on Lady Beatrice's instruction," Miss Crane said. "I observed the absence and informed her at once." There was no drama in the room, only a graceful tightening like the recalibration of a string quartet after a small discord. Outside, a motor bus sighed past, the sound muffled by the gallery's thick walls. Sebastian Hartwell was shown in, pale beneath his fashionable negligence. He took in the assembly, the letter on the blotter, Whitmore's strained poise, Lady Beatrice's composed stillness, and went rather quietly to a chair. "The study," he said, "is gone." Lady Beatrice's nod was almost maternal in its restraint. "We shall, of course, inform the insurer. For the present, discretion must be our watchword." Hartwell's hands, long and restless, stilled upon his knee. "Sir Geoffrey asked to see it last night," he murmured. He knew, somehow, that it existed. Alleyn did not pursue the line. The room itself was the witness he required. He examined the letter again, then the blotter. A pale grey impression ghosted beneath the lines, an earlier note taken and torn off. He caught only a fragment. "Candle sent on deliver, before 10. It could have been yesterday's instruction to a porter or merely the echo of some domestic errand. It lay there, like dust, suggestive and coy. "Mr. Whitmore," Alleyn said, "who was last in the office last night?" "I was, Inspector. I extinguished the lights at 11:45. Mrs. Pemberton had already left. Lady Beatrice's car took Miss Crane and Lady Beatrice together." "And you, Miss Crane, did you receive or dispatch any parcel after hours?" "No, Inspector. Not a flicker. We keep no after-hours deliveries." "There is," Mrs. Pemberton put in, almost apologetically. "A side door to Candle Court, used by the porters. It is bolted at dusk." "And bolted it was," Whitmore said quickly. "I attended to it myself." Alleyn inclined his head. The letter remained between his fingers, light as a feather and twice as ambiguous. Somewhere between a gentleman's punctilious habits and a gallery's impeccable routine, a small significant movement had occurred. It had made no noise. Yet everything, quietly, was different. The afternoon shortened into a grey that softened edges and made London appear to breathe more slowly. In such light, Alleyn's thoughts tended to arrange themselves, each observation settling in its proper place as dust returns to a mantelpiece after an ill-advised flurry with the feather duster. He walked from Montague Square to Candle Street without haste, as if the city's measured pulse might reveal a clue missed by more emphatic methods. At the gallery, the rooms had shed their evening glitter. A boy swept with a caution that suggested training rather than zeal, and the walls held their silence with professional aplomb. Alleyn paused before the reproduction of the veiled truth, not because he expected it to speak, but because it had already said more than was comfortable. The hidden figure within the drapery, glimpsed in the sketch and coaxed forward by ink on Sir Geoffrey's catalogue, was less a face than a presence, portraiture by inference. One could deny a likeness, but not the suggestion of intimacy. Ink. He thought of the delicate deepening on Sir Geoffrey's page, expertly done, invisible until it was not, and wondered at the hand steady enough to perform it without betraying itself. An artist's hand, certainly, or a curator's. or the competent, precise hand of a secretary who could forge a gentleman's script well enough to pass at a glance, and perhaps to imitate shadow as well as flourish. He did not linger on these names. He set them on their respective shelves and stepped back. Whitmore greeted him with outward calm and a slight, well-bred reservation. They spoke of inventories, of keys, of hours when time thins and the watchman's step grows louder in his own ear. Nothing in Whitmore contradicted itself, yet nothing relaxed. A professional man who had learned that survival in his trade required the absorption of shock without showing bruise. Miss Crane passed them in the corridor, with a file pressed too neatly to her side. She smelled faintly of a perfume Alleyn had encountered the previous night. Dry, modern, powderless. The telephone in Sir Geoffrey's study had preserved a whisper of it, as if acknowledging a caller polite enough to leave her calling card only in scent. Miss Crane's hands were very clean. There was, however, a minuscule dark fleck on the cuticle of her right forefinger, a dot so small the inattentive eye would miss it. Ink, possibly. It might have been obtained almost anywhere. Alleyn did not look at it twice. He found himself, late in the day, crossing the threshold of Sebastian Hartwell's studio at the back of a mews off Marylebone High Street. The room contained the familiar disorder of a life spent making meanings with pigment, rags, linseed, turpentine, careless brilliance. Hartwell's agitation had calmed into a brittle courtesy, the defiance of a man who knows panic is unattractive and tries to wear patience instead. "I did not poison Sir Geoffrey," he said abruptly, before Alleyn had asked a question. "I did not send a letter, nor did I steal my own portfolio." "Mr. Hartwell," Alleyn murmured, "if I wanted confessions, I should ask for them. I'm at the moment only accumulating human weather." Hartwell gave a short, unamused laugh. "Then note this. Sir Geoffrey was interested in the sketch because he believed it identified someone. He told me so at the end of the evening. He was imprecise about the who, quite precise about the danger." Alleyn looked at the palettes, the brushes laid out with unexpected order beside a sink forever stained. There were pigments here that would not do a weak heart any good, handled without care and transferred with ease to glass, to paper, to skin. A gentleman examining a page by lamplight, moistened finger turning a corner, one had seen the gesture in clubs often enough, might carry more than marginalia to his lips. Yet Sir Geoffrey's brandy stood hardly touched, his milk untouched, his medicine unopened. The death seemed to have occurred in the slip between habit and haste. It felt planned, yet dependent on personality. A method designed, not imposed. He left Hartwell with a mild word and returned home by way of the square's garden, where leaves collected in well-bred drifts against the railings. Troy, when he reached the house, was mixing greys on her palette with the concentration that transforms compromise into color. "You have that folding look," she remarked without turning. "I'm attempting to formulate a very quiet storm," he said. "Perfume?" she asked after a moment. "The crisp sort one puts on a clean sheet of paper rather than a person?" He smiled. "You always leap to the metaphor." "Yes, something dry, and a cigarette ash in a pipeman's room." "Then they were not trying to disguise themselves," Troy said. "They were trying to look as if they did not need to." He kissed her shoulder. "You are intolerable, my dear, when you are helpful." The pattern, such as it was, completed itself without fanfare. Access to the gallery safe had been restricted by keys and habit. Access to Sir Geoffrey's house by courtesy and routine. The forgery of a letter required nerve and knowledge. The deepening of a printed shadow required competence and motive. One could, if one wished, draw lines between these elements and find a single hand. Alleyn, just yet, did not wish. Instead, he telephoned Lady Beatrice and asked, in tones of the gentlest request, whether she would consent to a small gathering in her drawing-room on the following afternoon. "For the sake of tidiness," he said. "I find it soothes the dust." The gallery, after hours, had the hushed dignity of a chapel. The lights were lowered to a softened clarity, the canvases withdrew into their colors, and footsteps sounded with that faintly penitent echo peculiar to empty rooms where admiration is usually communal. Alleyn had asked for a few moments, nothing formal, a quiet word with those most immediately concerned. It was the kind of request few refused and none could comfortably evade. Lady Beatrice received him in the principal room, a dark wrap drawn about her shoulders as if she had grown chill. Whitmore stood a discreet pace behind, self-contained and grave. Hartwell lingered near the window, a cigarette unlit in his fingers, as if flame would betray him. Miss Crane, pale but impeccably controlled, took her place by a side table where a tray had been arranged. Tea, 2 cups, a decanter offering a more fortifying alternative. The scene might have been rehearsed. Indeed, it felt as if it had. Alleyn remained standing, his gaze moving with unobtrusive attention. "I am indebted to you all," he began, mild as the hour. "The difficulty in such matters," he inclined his head towards the dimness where Hartwell's centerpiece hung, "is not of evidence, but of interpretation. A picture admits many readings, yet the painter means a single thing. Our task, I think, is nearer to the painters than the critics." No one spoke. Lady Beatrice allowed herself the faintest smile. "You plan to critique us into truth, Inspector?" "Merely to suggest that truth will prefer to arrive with dignity," he said. "Sir Geoffrey died in the midst of a discovery. He had, in effect, lifted a veil. He was disturbed late, spoke sharply, a rarity, summoned a magnifying glass, and bent to a reproduction that, in his copy, had been most artfully amended. Within that amended image lay a private scene, recorded first in preliminary studies later entrusted to this house." He turned to Whitmore, "which were then removed by a hand accustomed to both keys and discretion." Whitmore inclined his head a fraction, neither protesting nor conceding. "The safe has not been forced," he said very evenly. "Quite," Alleyn returned. "The forge of the letter to Montague Square was competent, though not perfect. The paper, not Sir Geoffrey's. The spacing, too disciplined by office habit. It had the quality of something composed by a hand that is professionally tidy." He let this rest, a feather on still water. Miss Crane's lips pressed together. The silence acquired a shape. Alleyn continued with the same even temper. "Here is what troubles me more than craft. Sir Geoffrey declined his milk, ignored his brandy, and did not reach for his prescribed tablets. He was not thinking of himself. His attention had been caught and held. Someone telephoned from very near and very recently. The receiver retained a scent I recognize from the opening night." He inclined his head, courteous as a bow. "A beautiful perfume is an unwise emissary for clandestine calls." Lady Beatrice, to her credit, did not start. "I spoke to Sir Geoffrey shortly after I returned," she said levelly. "He had asked me, at the gallery, to consider a private matter. I was concerned for him, that is all." "And you came in person?" Alleyn asked, so gently that it could have been a kindness. "No." She glanced at Miss Crane, then away. "I telephoned, from home." The slight emphasis floated like a veil between them. Hartwell shifted, impatient. "This is an inquest conducted by epigram," he said. "If there is an accusation, make it. If there is a question, ask it." "There is a request," Alleyn said, still mild. "I believe a portfolio was removed from the gallery to prevent an interpretation becoming public, perhaps to spare a reputation, perhaps to protect someone more vulnerable than themselves. Fear, dressed as prudence, is no stranger to civilized rooms. If that portfolio were to return, quietly tonight, to Mr. Whitmore's safe, we should be spared unpleasantness. Absent its return, I shall be compelled to insist on the less agreeable method." Miss Crane looked down at the tray. "And if it does return, Inspector?" "Then I shall see it under proper conditions. he replied, "and we may discuss its meaning without the alarm that attends conjecture." Lady Beatrice placed her fingertips on the back of a chair, as though bracing there. "You assume our compliance. I appeal to your sense of arrangement." He inclined his head again, a courtesy to her kingdom of frames and proper lighting. "And I offer, in exchange, time, a small ration of it, enough for careful thought." He moved to go, then paused by Hartwell. "You were right to fear misreading," he said quietly. "But you were not wise in your guardianship. The world is always clever at divining what it wants to see." In the vestibule, the sounds of the street came thinly through. Alleyn turned as if recollecting something trivial. "Miss Crane, a word." She followed him into the smaller office where paper reigned. The lamp there made a modest circle of light. He glanced at a silver pencil on the desk, at a blotter that bore a ghost of Sir Geoffrey's hand, copied well, but not perfectly. "You have borne great responsibilities," he said, not unkindly. "It is a lonely occupation." Her composure did not break. It thinned. "Will there be scandal?" "There will be truth," Alleyn said. "What follows depends upon how promptly it is admitted." When he left her, the gallery seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, faintly, a clock chimed the quarter hour. A civilized sound, announcing time's passage with courtesy and without appeal. It was, he thought, the right music for an interlude before the curtain rose. The drawing room at Candle Street had been arranged for privacy rather than display. Lady Beatrice, in a gown of unassuming grey, sat very straight upon a small sofa, her hands folded with formal precision. Miss Leda Crane stood at the window, the blind half drawn, her profile composed and curiously calm. Inspector Alleyn, having requested this interview with the fewest words possible, remained standing until Lady Beatrice inclined her head in that quiet way of granting permission. "Miss Crane and I have spoken," he said, his voice as gentle as if he were offering particulars of a postponed engagement. "I believe it will spare you a harsher recital if I outline the matter and ask only for corrections." Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered. Distaste for melodrama, not fear. "Please, Inspector." It began, I think, when Sir Geoffrey recognized in Mr. Hartwell's veiled truth what most would not. A room he knew excessively well, his own. The preliminary studies lodged with your gallery revealed more than composition. They noted angles, placements, a habit or two. Behind the drapery, a figure, at first a cipher. In one of the studies, the shadow is too nearly a likeness to be flattering. Miss Crane's hands, perfectly still until now, unclasped. "You continued, Inspector," she said softly. "Pray finish." "Sir Geoffrey was an organized man," Alleyn continued. "He inquired after the studies, pressed the artist, pressed the gallery. A forgery, executed by an expert hand, purported to authorize their removal. The safe was opened by someone entitled to open it. The portfolio vanished. Sir Geoffrey, balked of tangible proof, spent his last hours poring over a catalogue that had been delicately improved. India ink deepening shadows to invite discovery. The edges of that same catalogue and the rim of his magnifying glass bore minute traces of cadmium pigment. He was an old man. He turned pages by touch and by habit. It was enough. Silence followed, the cultured sort that is not empty but considered. Lady Beatrice's gaze, fixed full upon Alleyn, did not waver. "And the motive you ascribe?" Alleyn's answer was not unkind. "Protection, a misguided chivalry. Miss Crane believed Sir Geoffrey would sacrifice reputation for leverage, and that yours would be the reputation at risk." At that, Miss Crane left the window and took her place beside Lady Beatrice, not quite touching her. Her voice, when it came, had the evenness of a clerk reading minutes. "He sent me a note, years ago. Not improper, never that, but compromising in its implication." When Lady Beatrice inherited the gallery, Sir Geoffrey considered himself its silent architect. He wished influence without responsibility. The study in Hartwell's sketch captured a visit that ought never have occurred. Lady Beatrice went to Sir Geoffrey to retrieve a private letter concerning her late husband's affairs. He insisted upon a meeting at his house, made certain it would seem clandestine if ever observed. Lady Beatrice's cheek coloured almost imperceptibly. It was an error of judgment, not conduct. Of course. Miss Crane's composure altered by a fraction. Sir Geoffrey knew the sketch showed more than a figure. It showed occasion. He meant to use it. I could not permit it. She set upon the table a slim parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with tape. James Whitmore's handwriting marked it plainly. Hartwell, Preliminary Studies. It has been in the linen press in Lady Beatrice's dressing room since the morning after his death. I intended to burn it, but matters outran me. Alleyn did not reach for the parcel at once. You visited Sir Geoffrey late, the scent upon his telephone, the ash in his dish, both yours. You spoke with him at midnight, and when he grew impatient and irritable, you contrived to soothe him into further examination. Yes, Miss Crane said. I believed he would live through the night. I thought merely to delay him until I could secure and destroy what he sought. Alleyn inclined his head. It was still murder, Miss Crane. Unintended and yet intended, she replied. The law will make its own distinctions. Lady Beatrice lifted her hand, then let it fall. Leda, it was always for you, Miss Crane said, and the words were as simple as the closing of a ledger. I am not ashamed of the motive, only of the method. Alleyn took the parcel then, with a respect that encompassed both what it contained and what it threatened. There will be no scene. I shall send for my sergeant. You will, if you wish, write a statement. Lady Beatrice, your name need not appear in anything but the most general terms. The law asks for facts, not adornments. The street's lamps, newly lit, pressed their pale circles upon the drawn blind. In that measured light, Miss Crane bowed her head, the smallest of gestures, as if accepting an appointment she had long deferred. The night rains had passed, leaving Candle Street rinsed and faintly luminous in the early light. The gallery's panes held an aqueous gleam, and within, the hush peculiar to rooms that have lately witnessed truth seemed to linger in the polished floors and careful frames. Miss Leda Crane arrived punctually at 9, as she always did. She removed her gloves, placed them with exactness upon her desk, and sat very still. Inspector Alleyn, who had asked for this hour, entered without ceremony and with none of the officiousness that sometimes attends such moments. James Whitmore, grave and very pale, stood just inside the office door, a discreet witness to official propriety. Lady Beatrice was not present. One understood that absences, too, could be acts of breeding. You advised I should put my statement in writing, Inspector, Miss Crane said. Her voice had recovered its customary clarity. I have done so. She offered an envelope, her handwriting precise, obedient to margins as to habit. Alleyn accepted it and did not open it. Thank you, Miss Crane. There was a small pause, not uncomfortable. Outside, someone rattled a key and the gallery's front bell chimed, distant as a recollection. One saw in such quiet the exact scale of a life. Ruled lines, punctual trains, the unassuming pens that pour out other people's letters. I should like it noted, Miss Crane added, that Sir Geoffrey had long been in the practice of collecting people's weaknesses, and that he did not always carry them lightly. Her gaze, level and unaccusing, rested on the window. There were drawings in that portfolio he had no right to see. Drawings never meant for exhibition. The figure behind the drapery had a face in earlier studies, a young woman's. It was not art that interested him. Whitmore looked down. His knuckles whitened on the leather ledger he held. We retain artists' confidences as we retain their works, he murmured, as if to himself. Or we ought to. Sir Geoffrey is beyond our judgments, Alleyn said. So for the moment, are we beyond, explanations. There will be time for both. His tone was courteous, almost impersonal, and something in it seemed to smooth the air between them. He informed her, without pride, that the portfolio had been recovered. A plain parcel, addressed to no one and placed in the night box of a small firm of mounters in Clerkenwell, had been collected at dawn. The ribbon remained, scorched where a match had brushed it. 2 studies were missing. In their place lay tissue leaves, carefully cut to size. "An archivist's conscience," Alleyn observed, without irony. Miss Crane inclined her head. "I did not wish the worst of it to survive me." "You anticipate more than is yet decided," Alleyn replied. "The court will consider intention and method. It is seldom kind to either." Her hands, capable, neat, rested upon her blotter. "I did not mean him to die at once," she said quietly, "only to be made ill enough to relinquish what he had begun. I thought fear might succeed where appeal could not. I did not comprehend the speed." Alleyn believed her. Belief did not alter the trajectory of events. He spoke gently of procedures, the formal caution, the car, the magistrate, counsel. Whitmore stepped aside as if yielding a path, and Miss Crane rose with a composure that had become, in these rooms, a species of grace. Down the corridor, a door opened. A breath of the gallery's upper light came softly to meet them. As they passed, a tray set for Lady Beatrice's late breakfast, thin toast, an orange, a folded newspaper, waited untouched, and the sight conveyed more eloquently than any pronouncement the extent of the morning's work. At Montague Square, blinds were drawn at half-mast. Mrs. Dalrymple, in starred apron, polished a silver frame with excessive care. She asked no questions and answered none. Her loyalty was a still lake in which stones were not thrown. Dr. Pemberton's discreet addendum arrived after luncheon. Phrases about exacerbating factors, vulnerability, delayed onset. The language of medicine, like that of art, could be exquisitely reticent when reticence was required. Sebastian Hartwell did not attend the day's proceedings. He sent a note, ink blotted where his hand had shaken, offering to withdraw from the Ashworth program. Lady Beatrice returned it with a single line in her measured hand. "You will paint, Mr. Hartwell. If there is penance, do it at your easel." As the car moved off with Miss Crane seated very straight beside a policewoman whose shoes shone immoderately, Alleyn watched the gallery's facade settle again into its role. Elegance as curtain, propriety as frame. Justice, he reflected, seldom aligns itself with satisfaction. It merely arrives and takes its place, not unlike a picture perfectly hung in a room that keeps its counsel. The house in Montague Square resumed its rituals with the self-respect of an old soldier buttoning a frayed tunic. Mrs. Dalrymple received the keys from the coroner's officer and, with a faint nod to Inspector Alleyn, set about returning Sir Geoffrey's study to a semblance of order. The milk glass was carried away at last. The pipe rack straightened. The Bakelite telephone polished free of every trace of perfume. In the recess behind the false panel, exactly where Miss Crane had said, lay the private collection whose existence had explained both influence and silence. Alleyn stood by while the inventory was made, each discreet atrocity recorded under the decent headings of evidence and custody. It was not triumph, it was housekeeping. The morning's letters contained one addressed in a secretarial hand to James Whitmore at the Ashworth Gallery. Inside, tied with the original black ribbon, the missing portfolio lay precisely as it had been before its impossible disappearance. There was neither signature nor apology, only a brief note. For return and proper custody. Whitmore, pale but steady, brought it to the yard without commentary. Later, he would admit to Alleyn that he had known, in the way one knows the weather in one's bones, that it would come back. Certain temperaments, he said, are incapable of leaving a ledger unbalanced. Sebastian Hartwell appeared in the square's garden after luncheon, walking with the uncertain gait of someone who has survived a narrow thing without wholly understanding it. He greeted Alleyn with a respectful awkwardness. "They say I shan't be charged," he managed. "I never meant any of it to." He stopped, groping for a word that would not betray him. "No," Alleyn said, "but you lent yourself to uses you did not examine. One hopes you will examine more closely in future." Hartwell nodded, shame and relief warring in his expression. "I have begun another canvas," he said after a moment. "Not veiled." He gave a strained laugh, half apology, half vow, and left him. Lady Beatrice requested a brief word in the gallery's smaller salon, its walls unadorned for the first time in years. "We will close a month," she said, the statement shaped like penance. "When we reopen, there will be rules where once there were assumptions. I misread what civility can shelter." She looked at him directly. Miss Crane's action was criminal. It was also a rebuke. One doesn't easily forgive either. Alleyn inclined his head, and she, reading in his courtesy neither absolution nor censure, accepted it as the only verdict she would receive from him. Of the mechanism he spoke to no one beyond the necessary circle. Cadmium yellow, finely worked into the metal lip of a magnifying glass and onto the cut edge of a catalogue's leaf, exacted its tax through patient handling. Sir Geoffrey, a methodical man, had returned again and again to the altered shadows, his fingers seeking the truth that had been coaxed into visibility. The forged letter had hastened the hour. The midnight call had tethered him to the chair. The unopened medicine bottle told the rest of the story with a precision that required neither flourish nor conjecture. Miss Crane went away with a composure undisturbed by the press's hungry speculation. Before she left, she had asked Alleyn whether the young men would have their property back. "Yes," he said, and her look, neither grateful nor relieved, but simply satisfied that sequence had been restored, was as close to sentiment as she permitted herself. She had wielded silence like a blade. Now she returned it to its sheath. In the late afternoon, Troy met him at the Ashworth threshold. Candle Street wore its evening with the unaffected elegance of a hostess who knows the lamps flatter. "You've finished," she said, taking his arm. "I have concluded," he corrected gently. Finished is not quite the word. They walked a little way, the gallery's windows dimming behind them. "The veil," Troy said. "In Hartwell's picture, was it drawn aside?" "Not torn," he answered. "It seldom is. It lifts enough to show a shape, and when it falls again, we remember the outline." He glanced back at the discreet facade. "What good we do in daylight. What harm we prevent is often done in the dimness before the lamps are lit." Rain began with a restraint proper to October, a faint pricking on stone and sleeve. In the square, Mrs. Dalrymple would be laying out the evening tray for no one, aligning cup with saucer as she had always done. At the gallery, Whitmore would be checking locks he had never before distrusted. Somewhere in transit, Lady Crane counted the stations without looking out of the window. Alleyn and Troy turned toward home. The lamps along Candle Street struck small halos in the mist, and in each halo one could imagine a dust of gold, harmless at last. The shadow that had lain there had not vanished. Shadows seldom do, but it had learned its place.